CASAT Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to Season 3 of CASAT Conversations. I am your host, Heather Haslam. This season, we will explore the weighty topic of health equity. Within each conversation, we will discover insights from researchers, practitioners, and experts on this complex and important topic. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Today, we welcome Dr. Lorraine Benuto, who's an associate and clinical psychologist with the University of Nevada, Reno. Welcome, Lorraine. We are happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as we get started, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspires you to do the work that you do in health equity.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a clinical psychologist and an associate professor in the Department of Psychology. I grew up just outside of Reno in a small rural town called Portola, so on the California side. And I became interested in psychology when I was very young. I was the only, or as one of very few ethnic minorities in my town. And so I became interested just in how culture impacts people. And so later when I was able to kind of understand my interests a little bit better, when I got to college, I realized I was interested in how culture impacts one's mind, how we view things, how we see things. And so that led me to focus on psychology and specifically on mental health. So that's kind of my trajectory in terms of getting to where I am currently.
Awesome. Well, we are happy to have you here today to share your wealth of knowledge and experience with us.
Thank you.
So can you describe, I know you're working on quite a few wonderful novel projects working to reduce health disparities. Can you tell us about some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the projects that I've been really excited about since starting my tenure at the university as a professor is what has evolved into sort of a broad, what we call kind of the telenovela project. And so telenovela is a Latin American soap opera, and it has dramatic storylines. It's very engaging and interesting and fun to watch. Very dramatic. And when I first became a professor, I became interested in how we could adopt this genre to help address some of the stigma in mental health that really contributes to a lot of the disparities that we see. And so originally, I was very interested in creating a single episode telenovela, very short, focused on targeting stigma. And so I had a graduate student who is now a psychologist. She's all finished, Dr. Frances Gonzalez, who undertook this project as her dissertation. And so we ran different focus groups with the Latino community and did some consulting with experts in the field. And we developed about a 4-minute video that shows a really fun storyline where there's a multi-generational family. So there's like some nieces, some aunts, kind of what you would expect to kind of see in a traditional Latino family, gathered around having pan y café, which is a very common practice. So it's the sweet bread and coffee that you might have actually usually in the evening as a way of kind of unpacking your day. And so we see this family in the kitchen, and they are talking about one of their family members. She's there and she's struggling with some depression. And so through a conversation they have, we show the different types of stigma that come up when we talk about mental health. So we have like a character who's an antagonist who kind of, says like, are you saying you're crazy? What exactly is it you're saying? Which would be a prototypical response that we would see within that context. And then we see another character kind of saying like, no, hold on a minute. Like, this is what mental health is. This is what mental health services are. So that was the first video that we developed, and it was live action. And my team had a plan to develop then a series of videos where we would see, originally it was going to be that same character struggling with depression, going to see a psychologist, and then kind of walking through what does it look like to see a psychologist? What's that intake session look like? how do you call and get an appointment? And then actually watching the person go through psychotherapy. So what are the skills that we would teach in a prototypical session? Um, we had big plans for that to be, like I said, a spin-off of that original episode, but then COVID hit. And so we had to pivot and we used animation instead. And so we came up with a new plot line and new characters and things like that. And so um, I love this project because what it does is it still targets stigma, um, but it really increases accessibility. And so, one thing we see that really contributes to health disparities is that this population tends to be under resourced. So, for lots of different reasons, they have a hard time accessing mental health services. So, it could be financial, it could be contextual. They might not have transportation to services. They might not have childcare to go do this. They might not have health insurance. And so, um, they could sit there at home and they could watch these episodes, learn these skills. And so it really reduces a lot of the barriers that we commonly see. So, yeah, I'm very excited about that. We finished filming and right now we're about to test run it with some participants and see if they like it, see how well it works. And then we have a number of other similar projects using that same framework in the pipeline.
That's so cool. I can't wait to see it and experience it. Can you highlight for us? It sounds like in those focus groups, some of the stigmas were really brought to light. Can you share with us what the stigmas are?
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw when we ran these focus groups, and we did them with we played around with a lot of different ideas, but ultimately we decided to focus on women because there's a higher prevalence rate of depression among women and Latino women specifically. And also we wanted the characters to be really relatable, and we kind of had a hard time figuring out how to do a multi-gendered video that would be broadly relatable. And so instead we focused on one population with the end goal being that eventually we'll want to do the same thing with men. But we saw the stigmas, to get back to your question, the stigmas that we saw among the Latino women that emerged from the focus groups were things like fear of being labeled. That was kind of a big one. And the original video that we created is called Yo no estoy loca, which translates to I'm not crazy. And that language specifically came out of the focus group. So there was a lot of concern that if we as Latinos expressed that we were suffering from a mental health affliction like depression or even anxiety, that we would be labeled or viewed by our community as crazy. And so we really tried to target that in the stigma video that, that's not what this means, that kind of trying to normalize, common psychological maladies like depression or anxiety. So that was a really big one that came about. There was also a fear of this somehow making one weaker. So there's this, I think, cultural value of strength. And so there was this stigma around having either a mental illness or seeking services that might be viewed as weak. Instead of being strong, you're viewed as weak. There was also a lack of what we called mental health literacy. So a lot of the stigmas arose out of people's misunderstandings of, what does depression mean? What does anxiety mean? What does it mean to see a psychologist? Am I going to be hospitalized? Am I going to have to, take medication? Those types of things. And so we saw this sort of interesting connection, although not surprising, between literacy, mental health literacy, and stigma. And so people who had lower mental health literacy seemed to have more stigma around things. And we wanted the video to be educational in nature because we felt that by correcting some of the misconceptions, we could kind of in turn reduce stigma.
That is fascinating and so cool to hear. I love focus groups for that reason and highlighting, some of these things that we're just not aware of. I'm curious, was there anything surprising to you in the focus groups, or did it play out the way you sort of thought it would?
I think that I having grown up in this culture, I think a lot of the things we noticed really resonated with both myself and my team, because my team at that time, and still is the case now, was Latina. So we were kind of like, oh yeah, we've seen these same trends in our families. So I don't think that element was as surprising, was surprising per se. But what was kind of surprising was that there was this enthusiasm and this desire for access to resources by the focus group participants. So even though it was like, I don't want to be labeled as crazy, I don't want to be perceived as weak, I don't really know what seeing a psychologist entails, it was like, but I do experience sadness and I do experience stress, and I would really love to have some resources that I could access that could help me with those things. And so I think there was this general openness to help. And I don't know if I think that was a little bit surprising to me, that there was that perhaps there were less psychological barriers than I expected there to be.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it was validating just based on your own personal experience. But then also, I'm curious if that enthusiasm and desire for resources really fueled your passion or the projects that you're working on.
Yeah, I think we were very excited by that. And then we kind of, as a team, we're like, okay, now what? I run a clinic where we provide free services to Latino victims of crime or violence, and then a sliding scale clinic where people who are Spanish speaking can access services at a lower cost. But I know for a fact that the resources available in Northern Nevada and across the United States for Spanish speakers is not sufficient to meet the need. And that's where we see a lot of those access disparities to care. And so we became, I think, very enthusiastic and excited about like, okay, how do we develop novel ways to get people who really need services? And so then, from there, we kind of said like, okay, can we create a series? The video was very well received. And can we show skills we would teach in therapy in that series in a fun and engaging way so that we don't lose our audience? And that's how we ended up down this wonderful rabbit hole that we're in right now.
And what are some of the ways that you're working to reduce some of the access disparities?
Yeah. So that was, I'm very interested in access as a means of reducing mental health disparities. And so in some of our brainstorming sessions, when I first started running my clinics, I had very few bilingual providers. And now I have way more bilingual providers, which has been wonderful. But at that time, about 5-6 years ago, I didn't. And so we were like at our cap of like what we could do for the community. And so we started to ask ourselves, okay, what could we do to reach that Spanish speaking community who really can't access services in Northern Nevada and more broadly just across the country. And so I became interested in using interpreters or translators in psychotherapy. And so my team and I looked at the literature and we said, okay, what do we know about the use of interpreters and translators in psychotherapy? And there's some research on it. There's some guidelines, but there's not a whole lot. And one of the challenges, I'm teaching a diversity class right now, and I have economics students in my class. And he was funny because he said, I would, as an economist, I would never employ a professional interpreter as a way to reduce or to address the gap in service providers and the clients who need it because it's so expensive. And he's right. So interpreter services run, I don't have the figure off the top of my head, but it's very expensive. It's like $100 an hour or something like that. So if you're thinking about the cost of a psychotherapy hour plus the cost of an interpreter, suddenly this is a really hefty price tag for a population that already has challenges accessing service. So I looked I said to myself, okay, well, what resources are available to you that are either free or low cost, And so I thought of the undergraduates here at UNR, and I thought there's all these undergraduates who speak Spanish who are psych majors or, human development and family study majors or social work majors. They're in like this helping area. And they already have some foundation in psychology. Could I train them as part of like a class that they take, like an experiential class, to do interpretation and psychotherapy? And then can I train my therapist on how to effectively work with a translator? And so we ran a project that went, I think, for about 2 years until I got more bilingual staff, where we utilize undergrads, and they got this very valuable and interesting and fun training experience. And we got to use interpreters who were native speakers for the most part, who had some foundation already in psychology. So the uptraining was not as profound as if I just picked someone off the street who had no background whatsoever in a helping profession. And so we did that, like I said, for a couple years. And I always am evaluating my programs. I want to know what's working, what's not working. And we looked at the program evaluation data that we'd collected, and we had really excellent treatment response rates. So we do like quality improvement in my clinics as well. And so one of the things I did was I talked with the clients after they had met with the therapist and the interpreter, and just said, like, how'd it go? What was your experience? And what we found in general is that the clients loved the interpreter. Like, they loved the interpreter. They had a lot of camaraderie with them and rapport because they felt like there was a shared cultural heritage. And then we also found that they loved the therapist. They were very grateful to the therapist. And they got better. They learned skills to help them with, primarily we treat anxiety and depression. And they got much better over the course of that. And so that was kind of our attempt at how do we address the bilingual treatment provider gap in a cost-effective way? Because I'd love to not have to think about financial resources, but the reality is that we do have to. And that was just a project that we ran, and the students really loved it. And then the therapists, a lot of them reflected that this was the first time they had ever gotten any sort of training on how do you work with someone as a therapist who doesn't speak the same language as you do. So they also found a lot of value in that.
And I'm curious, what were some of the best practices that you found for clinicians working with an interpreter and their patient?
Yeah, one of the key things was that we really wanted to look at this as a team-based treatment approach. And so, I know this is a podcast and not a video, but kind of making a triangle with my fingers. And so the idea being that the team was comprised of the therapist, the interpreter/translator, and the client, and that they were all working together collectively. One of the concerns and this is in the scientific literature when we look, I knew this concern existed, and I saw this concern reflected in the therapist, is that there's this kind of worry that in psychotherapy, the relationship between the client and the therapist is really important, that there was this worry that the relationship between the client and the therapist would be thwarted by the interpreter because there's this kind of third party there. And we didn't see that exactly, but we did see a strong bond through the interpreter and the client. And the therapist at times could kind of maybe feel a little bit left out because, they're speaking a different language and things like that. And so one best practice was what we called pre-briefing and debriefing, which was that prior to every session, the therapist and the interpreter would meet, and they would discuss like what the plan was for the session. And then at the end of each session, they would process the session. And so they could talk about whatever, came up, like perhaps like it seemed like the interpreter and the client kind of got off topic a little bit together, just things like that, so that they could problem solve and then have this very strong working relationship where the end goal is essentially to help the client move forward. So that came out kind of as like a best practice, that this is a team-based approach, and debriefing and pre-briefing can really help facilitate that kind of team effort.
That's fantastic. I'm also struck by, that this idea really came from this economics student that you had in your class, and how cool it is when students, bring up these questions or concerns that then lead your research and your programming down this fascinating path.
Yeah, it was funny too, because his reflection was, if I was running a clinic, it would be more cost effective for me as from an economical perspective, to send a non-Spanish speaking therapist to learn Spanish than it would for me to perpetually pay for the cost of an interpreter. That was kind of like another comment that he had made. that I've been rolling in my mind. And like, this is like so interesting. I think oftentimes we get stuck in like a rut of like, okay, these are the challenges and barriers that exist. And they're not solvable, like I can't pay an interpreter all this money to, make the clinic run. And so I just really believe that trying to be creative, even if that creativity is imperfect, is one mechanism for helping, our field progress and move forward.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really highlighted by these awesome projects that you've been doing, is that creativity definitely seems to be a strength of yours. And, thinking outside of the box, like, okay, so this is what we find to be where we're at right now and the facts of where we're at now. And then how do we move forward with what we have?
Yeah.
There's a lot of ingenuity in there.
Thank you.
So I want to go back to the beginning when you talked about why you got into psychology, and you said that you're really interested in how culture impacts people, and then that led you to how culture impacts one's mind. And so if you can share with us really some insights on that, I think that would be great.
Or yeah, I was a peculiar child, having these thoughts without a conceptualization of psychology or what it was. But I just knew that, inside my home, like inside our home, it was very much Mexico. Like we, all the customs, the things that we did, the values that we held were based in Mexican culture. And then when I would exit my home, I was kind of put into this very American context, which for me as a child felt very different. And so I think I didn't feel that other people really understood me. The people who I was around did not understand me. And I, at some level, felt like that had an impact on me. And so then when I was a little bit older, about 12, I was reading a book, and the book had a therapist in it. So there was a storyline about this teenager who was struggling and needed to see someone. And so then I learned what a therapist was and what a psychologist was. And I was like, this is what I want to do with my life. So then I, went on to college, majored in psychology, and there was kind of better able to understand, okay, what you're really interested in is how cultural differences affect people, and so then, that kind of led me to being interested in research and that kind of intersection of clinical science, essentially of how do we do research to make things better for people. And the population I was really interested in was the one I grew up with. And so I went to graduate school, and then through a lot of, I think, fortunate circumstances, ended up in Reno, which is where I wanted to live, all that kind of stuff. And so I feel like all my dreams have come true, essentially, which I'm so grateful for. I'm so grateful. But yeah, I've been able to, essentially study, research, develop programming on the things that I've always been really interested in. So I think I got on a tangent though, and I'm not sure that I answered your question.
That's okay. I loved the story. The question is how culture impacts one's mind. And I think, what you were highlighting is this difference between home life and values and customs, and then American culture and not feeling seen and valued. And I'm curious, like, how do you see us being able to bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think I was teaching earlier before this. I was teaching, and I'm teaching this class on cultural diversity, and we talk about all kinds of different topics. And one thing that we talked a lot about is what we call diversification of the profession. And so when we look at statistics, and this isn't specific to psychology, we can look across lots of different fields. We see that ethnic minorities tend to be underrepresented. It's not rocket science. This is just essentially kind of what it is in lots of different sectors, mental health being one of them, which leads to kind of the challenges, I've observed and try to develop solutions for. But I think, one way that has begun to be bridged is through diversification of the profession. And so we see When I started, I came back to Reno in 2009, it was. And at that time, I want to say that there were maybe 3 Spanish-speaking providers in Northern Nevada. And I've really seen that number grow. And so I think the way we bridge this is through diversification of the profession. It helps us and allows us to reach more populations. It allows us to kind of infiltrate positive messages around mental health and other elements of health into communities that were harder to reach before. And so I think we've made a lot of progress, and it'll continue to kind of trend in that direction.
Yeah, and it makes me think about your series, really reducing that stigma and showing, Latinas in treatment, but then also as clinical psychologists, and so that you see that as a possibility as well, as we look at diversification and profession.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, in academia, or in especially in programs where there's a focus on science and that intersection between science and kind of mental health, there's a lot of pressure, or maybe for lack of a better term, and or focus on, producing students who will graduate and go into academia. So they'll go on to be researchers. And I always tell students when they interview to work with me that I'm very comfortable with their aspirations being whatever they are, whether it's they want to go into the workforce as a clinician, or they want to go and be a researcher, or they want to go and teach, whatever it is they want to do, because I see all of those pieces as making a really big impact on the field. And so my students are always coached to pursue what they're passionate about. And if that is, going into the workforce as a clinical psychologist and seeing clients, I think that helps us reach that population that we've kind of struggled to reach in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Will you tell us about some of the clinics that you are the director of, and the services that are provided, and we'll make sure those get added to the show notes as well?
Absolutely. So when I first started as a professor, I got an invitation to apply for some funding, and I applied and I got it. And so I was able to start kind of my first clinical program with that funding. And I developed what we call La Clinica VIVA. And that clinic is specifically targeted for Spanish speakers who have a history of exposure to violence, who have been victimized in some way. And we're able to provide services now for, I think, the 6th or 7th year for free to anybody who meets that qualification. And so I was very excited about developing that program because it is a culturally specific program targeted at a population who had access to very limited services. And so through, I've sort of seen I think this is probably somewhat specific to Nevada kind of being a smaller state, population wise, is I've found that, as I've developed programming, that programming has opened other funding doors. And so it's allowed me to create additional programs. So then I end up being very, very busy running lots of different programs. So we have, we have that program. We also run Thrive, which is therapy and healing from, I'm going to mess the acronym up, from interpersonally violent experiences. And so that is for people who've experienced domestic violence. They can be English speaking or Spanish speaking. But we're again able to provide free services in the community. About 3 or 4 years ago, I got a grant to create a abuse prevention program. And so we developed what we call Sierra Families, and we don't advertise it as like, come see us, we'll help prevent you from committing child abuse, because probably people would not come if that was our approach. And so instead we focus on teaching families healthy parenting skills and coping mechanisms and things like that. And then, because I feel bad for the catchment of people who are Spanish speaking and who can't qualify for any of those free services, we also just do sliding scale services where people can come in and they can see us and receive services in Spanish based on their income. So, yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Huge, awesome resources for the community. Is there anything else that you feel is important for our listeners to know about health equity?
I think, I think the thing I really hope people understand is that there are a lot of systemic challenges that people, especially people of color, experience in terms of accessing health care, whether it's mental health care or physical care. I think, you asked me a question earlier about like, what was surprising to you about, what you learned from your focus groups. And I think one key thing is that it's oftentimes not because people don't want to access these resources, even if they do have stigma, it's much more likely to be that there's significant barriers, be they financial or logistical, that keep them from accessing resources. And I just think it's really important to figure out how to break those barriers down.
Absolutely. Well, as we close, with all the hats that you wear, I'm curious, what do you find to be most meaningful in your work?
I think I've had to think about this a lot because I've had to think about how to categorize, kind of how to compartmentalize, like how much of my time I spend across like the different domains. And I think ultimately that the most important hat that I wear is one as an educator, because, I work with a team of graduate students and undergraduate students, and ultimately they're going to form the workforce that is going to really address the issues that I really, really care about. And so it's almost a way of casting a wider net. I do love, I love to do therapy with, I love to treat, it's a little bit of a weird statement, but I love to treat people with trauma, and I love to do that. But then I can only target that one person I'm working with versus when I'm training students, I know that they're going to go out and do a lot. So I think that the hat of educator is the one that I see as most important.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all of the work that you're doing and for helping to shine a light on some of the stigma, as well as to tell us about some of the novel projects that you're working on. We really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Thank you for listening to CASAT Conversations, your resource for exploring behavioral health topics. We hope you found today's conversation timely and meaningful. Please share this podcast with your friends and colleagues. If you want to learn more, visit us at our blog at CASATOnDemand.org.
CASAT Podcast Network. This podcast has been brought to you by the CASAT Podcast Network, located within the Center for the Application of Substance Abuse Technologies at the University of Nevada, Reno. For more podcasts, information, and resources, visit CASAT.org.